Welcome to juliemangotv. I'm Rachel Osborne. Joining us today are Jennifer Holness and Sudz Sutherland, the creators of BLK and Origin Story, a four-part documentary series that explores the rich history of Black people in Canada, affirming that Black history is indeed Canadian history. Thanks for joining me, Jen and Sudz. Happy to have you.
Hello, absolutely ready to go.
All right. So, like I said, I like to start these conversations off with a nod to heritage. So, could you both describe your heritage and how your family ended up in Canada?
Absolutely. I guess I'll go first. So, Jen Holness, I'm actually born in Jamaica, Mobay, and my family, who was sort of in the Salt Spring area, came to My mom came to Canada when I guess in the late '60s, early '70s, and I came to Canada when I was 6 years old, and so we our connection to Jamaica was primarily through my grandmother and a couple of aunts. And so growing up, we would go back to Jamaica like maybe every 2 or 3 years, and to hang out and meet some of our cousins. And so my Jamaican heritage is very important to me. In addition to that, my last name Holness is that I'm actually related to Andrew Holness. I think
Oh,
our grandfathers were brothers, and and my dad Noel Holness is I guess the connection there. So there you have it.
all right. So, how about you?
My parents are both Jamaican. They met in London, England in the swinging 60s. And then they came they were forced with a choice, where, they're like, there's not too much forward movement in London, England. The class system is like really hard to break. And so they're looking for opportunity in North America. And so they chose to come to Toronto, where myself and my sister Natalie were born. And so they always took us back to Jamaica every couple years. My dad's from Boscobel, which is like just outside Ochi, between Ochi and uh, Aracabessa, and on the North Shore there by the Boscobel Hotel, and James Bond Bay and James Bond Beach, that club there. And we were always brought back to Jamaica every couple years just to know where we're from, right? And it's one of the things that we try to do with our daughters. We have three daughters, and we are married. We have three daughters, and we are trying to see every Caribbean island. That's our goal. That's one of our life goals. So we've seen it
Thank
quite
you.
a bit, but we're trying to see always much more because our parents only took us back to Jamaica.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, what do you want to go to some other island for, right? And we film. We've done some filming in Trinidad, so we lived in Trinidad for a number of months.
Right
Um,
home again, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
we did that, and we got caught trouble from Jamaica for filming parts of Home Again
Yeah.
in Trinidad, but Jamaica wasn't coming up with no cash, so
Yeah, they don't have a rebate, so they can't complain,
we
right?
can't complain.
I
So
like the way you think because that's exactly it.
it's
Yeah.
business. It's a
It's
business.
a big problem, I think, because I think a lot more diaspora people would film in Jamaica if there was that rebate. So film is a business, right?
Yep.
Business, and the thing is we need a tax base, and it just goes to speak about in terms of like how we can move forwards, how Jamaica can move forwards in this economy, because they have to have some tax base to provide for these rebates. So this is, again, it's a part of an ongoing conversation, and we were talking to the junior minister of trade, all these people for years, and it's been no change since then.
Yes. We will talk about that more later off air.
More time.
Oh gosh. Okay, so let's jump right into why we're here. Um, the thesis for BLK and Origin Story is that Black history is Canadian history. I love that. And I always thought of historical erasure as a modern problem, but this series made it clear that like the suppression of our stories is as old as the events themselves. Either of you, what was the catalyst for you as storytellers that made right now or now the time to tell these stories and correct the hypocrisy, the hypocritical narrative of Black stories in Canada?
Well, I think like one of the things that we have to say is that this has been a kind of an odyssey over the last 20 years trying to tell these stories. We did a
Okay.
film called Speakers for the Dead that was almost 20 years ago, and that looked at a erasure of Black communities in Priceville, which is southwestern Ontario, on the way to Owen Sound. And so this was something that we've been trying to tell. We've had these stories since then. We discovered these stories and carried these stories about 20 years ago in the early 2000s. And then now finally got the opportunity when we were invited to pitch the chorus, and they said, well, what do you got? What do you got? What do you want to talk about? And we were like, we got a whole bunch of stories over here. We'd love to share with Canada, because we believe that this history is Canadian history. It's not just quote unquote Black history. History is not something like laundry where you can separate the whites from the Blacks, from the Indigenous, from the Asian, because we got it all in this. All of this is in BLK and Origin Story.
Right. Can I just add one thing? The only thing I could add is that I think it was the murder of a Black man that is the catalyst for us being able to tell this story, because of George Floyd and what it is and what it brought, the understanding it brought to the dominant culture in Canada. And by that I mean white folks. There was a sense that, oh, wait a minute, we haven't been servicing our Black communities. And that is, in my mind, is the trigger to this, because as Sudz says, we've had these stories that we wanted to tell for decades, and the opportunity came about because there was a shift in Canada.
Right. So it's more that audiences were ready for it, not that you were ready. You were always ready to tell these stories.
We would pitch people. And
The money was ready.
They just, like,
The
right,
money was ready, girl. They were ready to put some money.
Okay. I mean, it speaks to a larger problem, right?
Yes, it
The
does.
systemic racism that we see
Absolutely.
in media, in every industry.
Yep.
All right. So, in this debut episode, you really show the deceit and violence, and if we're naming it, white supremacy, that came with the 3 distinct migrations to Nova Scotia, which ultimately led to dependency on the state because of the conditions that people were living in. They were promised land, they never get land. They were promised all these things, they never got it, right? So in the process of producing the series, how did you see that same theme of like forced dependency manifest in other Black communities outside of Nova Scotia?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, look, in modern times, right? We don't have quote unquote projects in the way that it's understood in the U.S. But Ontario housing, policies that punish single moms, whereby if they it's difficult to have families, and have support. I mean, these policies are ingrained, historically and present day. Look, what I did the Nova Scotia episode. I wrote and directed that one, and what I saw was that Black folks in Canada, they came from the US, they came from Jamaica, they came from other places of the Caribbean, but the way that they were treated was exactly the same. And rather than support those communities to give them the same opportunities that they gave to white settlers, that didn't happen. So a lot of Black people, by the way, starved. A lot of the abuse that Black folks experienced, that abuse is not as visceral, in the sense of like, you saw pit houses. It's not as visceral as that, but it's putting them into Ontario housing. It's policing in a way that that doesn't lead to any kind of solutions. It's creating these communities where they don't put resources into the communities to develop. It's also, let's face it, we've had a history where Black folks weren't given the same economic opportunities for jobs. right? So those are like, I mean, like those things are not as visceral as, like, in 1780s and 1814 and so forth, but it's the same kind of policy. And then when things don't work out, when black folks don't prosper, they say, well, what happened here? They blame black folks. So that's been my experience. I just feel it as like it's like a what is it, something like where it's just it keeps going. It just changes a little bit in the presentation,
Okay.
in my mind.
Well, one of the features, Rachel, when you're talking about this sort of quote unquote state dependency,
Mhm.
and within the context of white supremacy, it's like where we live in Canada, we live in a neighborhood, right? And people say it's nature, nurture, and neighborhood. And so the neighborhoods of black folks, if you want to look at Africville, if you want to look at Little Burgundy, if you want to look at Hogan's Alley, um, they are marked by deprivation. So they stop giving the services. They don't give, they don't put investment in the education infrastructure. They don't put, what I mean? So this is like over course of decades, you get the situation where black folks aren't on an equal playing field. Their children go to inferior schools. We have less and less choices and opportunities in terms of jobs. So like this is what happened to us. So we want to talk about this story about what happened to us over time to say that, okay, well, there's certain, understanding that there are reasons for where we find ourselves right now. There are reasons why we're over policed. We can draw that back to the formation of police in the first place in terms of them being slave patrols. That's where the police started from. So having a knowledge of history arms you to deal with the present day. And so by sharing this knowledge, it's like history is like electricity. If it's power, if we don't share it, nobody's going to do nothing with it. And it's like
Right.
we won't progress unless we share this information. And there's so many young black kids in school today who feel that they haven't made a contribution or that they don't feel a part of Canada. And the truth is we've been here. We've been here since 1508. We've been here and we've made a contribution to this place, an indelible contribution. We settled this place and also we're in communication and we're a part of the indigenous family of this place.
Right.
As you saw in the video, you saw in the film. So the thing is that we want this story to be told and to be shared so that we can dismantle white supremacy. We can dismantle the patriarchy because everybody will be better off if that's the case. There's a lot of white people out there who cease to be human because they're too busy being white and they don't see the injustice. Exactly. I mean, you see it, right? Somebody sees George Floyd get murdered and says, well, he was just resisting arrest. I'm like, that right there, you stop being a human being. You're really concerned about being a white person and supporting the state. That is the difference here. We want people to be more human because I think that one of the things that indigenous folks and black folks will be bringing in this new century is a humanity, increased humanity, so that we're all sisters, we're all brothers, and all of our lives are worthy. You know what I mean? Because that's what I believe, that your life is just as much as valuable as my life, as the CEO of whatever, Jeff Bezos, his life is same. It's all the same life force.
Yeah. Whew. Sorry, that was heavy. And the thing, as you're talking about children in school, it's crazy that this education that you're providing had to happen in an entertainment space versus an educational space.
Yeah, but you know what's interesting? If you think about it, someone said it to Charmaine Nelson, Dr. Charmaine Nelson. I think she's really brilliant. She pointed out, and I've ever since thought about it, most of what we understand today is through media. So think about slavery, for example. Roots was the first time many Black people even understood what slavery was, because Black people weren't going to the library and taking out books on slavery, right? Well, there's a slave. These are the ways in which we understand like huge systems, right? And so for me, I feel like media has the power to educate. And Sudz and I, we take this responsibility really seriously. So when we did this show, the series, 4 episodes, we wanted to get it right. We weren't able to put everything in because God knows we had 45 minutes to tell the entire story of Halifax or Nova Scotia, which is insane because it's so huge. 3 epic migrations, and I mean epic. But what we really wanted to do was get it right, and with the idea that young people in particular will be able to see this and understand that Black people were foundational to Canada, and that they have a stake in Canada. They're not just interlopers or immigrants, of which, by the way, I'm proud to be, but to only present that narrative of Black people, we think is hugely problematic. So we've created something, a tool that can be used in the way that media is actually already being used to educate. Because when people saw Black folks as pimps and prostitutes, that was the narrative, and that's how they saw us, right? And so as content creators, it's our duty to make art that can also inspire and inform and entertain.
And it did that because I learned a lot. So in that vein, let's talk about the Maroons, because I had a lot of feelings about the way that everybody who spoke about them described them. Like everybody in the episode had this way of talking about the Maroons. So for everyone watching who hasn't seen the episode yet, we're going back to 1796. And for me, because after I watched the episode, I had to run downstairs to my husband. He has only been in Canada since 2016. He's Jamaican as well. And I said, did you know that, that Jamaicans have been here since 1796? And I think it was Kanika who said it, one of the descendants of the Colley family in Nova Scotia. She said, the Maroons did not come to Canada as slaves. They could not be controlled by the British in Jamaica. They were too strong a people. I said, yes, that sounds like us,
Yep.
So she talked, and then we go on to see that, there were wars that were fought in Jamaica, the Maroons against the British, and the societies that they created for themselves and adapting to the land. There's so many good things to know about Maroons. And then in the context of coming to Canada, I mean, for me, there were a lot of emotions. What about you guys? Like, what was the emotional journey like to unearth these parts of our history in this episode?
Okay, so you're gonna make me cry because honestly, I just had this wave, just this powerful wave of how special it was to be able to tell a little bit of this story that is Jamaican, that is Canadian, that is actually African because of Sierra Leone as well. I actually wanted to tell the entire episode to be about the Maroons and COVID, because I just thought that story was just so incredible. I didn't know, I heard that Jamaicans had come to Nova Scotia. I didn't know the context, right? And to know, to research and to find out that they helped to build Citadel Hill. Because remember, at the time, the military, that was a pivotal space for the British, in terms of defending their global dominance, right? That port was huge. And so the Maroons coming there, the fact that they were respected, the fact that they couldn't, even here, when they came here, they came with the same mentality that we are strong people who expect to be respected. And when they couldn't be respected the way that they wanted to be, they left. I was like, oh my God, this was just so, but with the legacy they left behind, because, some stayed, and to have that whole, and, mixing up with the governor general. And I was like, that's really, come on. And it's part of this entire branch, right? All of that stuff was just, I was just in love with being able to tell that story. And my only regret is that I just didn't have enough more time to tell the story of their time in Canada, because there's a lot more of what the nuances, but I wanted to at least give people enough to understand this powerful story and the interconnections of Black people. So that's what I, at the very, but it was really special to be able to do that.
For sure. And I have to give it up to your experts. They were so passionate. At one point, I'm like, yes, yell at me, tell me the things. You know what I mean? They everyone, they called out everything. They, I don't know, even I don't know how to describe it, but just like every person that spoke in this episode had such passion, is the only word I can use to describe it.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of directing. And Sudz and I are really very passionate about finding the right voices. These are all experts. We didn't put words into their mouths, but we found people, and I'm really grateful, that were so eloquent. Like, for example, George Eliot Clark. His ability to communicate story was just brilliant. And even Professor Bilby, who is like a white dude from America, we flew him in because when I interviewed him, I thought his understanding and his passion about telling the story of the Maroons was so great. I felt like we needed to have him in the thing, right? In the series. So that's a big part of the work that we do as creators, so showrunners or whatever, Sudz and myself, is that this commitment to finding great people to communicate this information, because you don't want somebody to come in and saying, A, this is not correct, which is we're on point. And B, you want people to see that how talented most of the folks we have in the show are diasporic people, Black folks, whether they've been here, their family's been here for hundreds of years, or more recent immigrants. But we wanted, again, also to show like how the intellect, the power, Dr. Saini, for example, with his Trinidadian accent. Yes. I mean, I wanted them all in there, and you'll see Ontario in 4 weeks, and it has some brilliant communicators as well. But it was important to us to make the show that delivered that.
Yeah, it definitely did that for me. So the story of, because you mentioned Sierra Leone, I'm glad you did, because when the Maroons got here, they were received by royalty. They fought they fought alongside the British Army. They got their nice pin that said Maroon or Jamaica to the Maroons. So yes. They built landmarks, like you said, the Citadel, government buildings, and as you mentioned, some of them fought to leave because the conditions were just not good, right? So they went to Sierra Leone and not back to Jamaica. Did you see Freetown come up again as like a mecca for liberated peoples from other parts of Canada?
Not from other parts of Canada so much, but what with Freetown, what actually happened is this, and I try to explain it, but when the Black loyalists were having a terrible time in Nova Scotia, they were literally dying. They lobbied. They sent an emissary to the UK to lobby to find somewhere else to go. And the British, all these Blacks had fought on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War. And suddenly they had all these Black people that they had promised something to. And they're like, what do we do with them? What do we do with them? We don't want them all in Britain. We don't need their labor as much. So Thomas Peter ended up in conversation and discovered that the British were thinking of sending Black people back to this place, Sierra Leone, right? And so came back to spread the news. And as you said, half of the loyalists decided to go, and more would have gone, but the Canadians made it very difficult. I wasn't able to.
They needed the labor.
They needed the labor. So now, when the Maroons came, they were also lobbying. They began 1 year in. They began lobbying to the British government and the king and queen, saying, "We want to go. We need to leave." And so that lobbying got them, and it was 7 ships that took them back to took them to Sierra Leone,
Right.
and so it had been established, but someone paid for that. So the British government, the Canadian government, they paid for them to go to Sierra Leone. They couldn't actually go back to Jamaica because they had actually been deported out of
Right.
Jamaica. And you know what happens when with deportation, right? They don't want you back. I find it hysterical, by the way, and Sudz can comment on this too, that Jamaicans were deported to Canada and
Yeah.
couldn't go back home. To me, that is just hysterical. So just finding that out so Sierra Leone though had been established because of the Loyalists, and then the Maroons went over there, and ironically, they ended up actually fighting the Loyalists, and then ultimately they all came together. The other thing about that Sierra Leone colony was that because the British were trying to cut off American power, and what they did, they actually were on the seas finding slave ships, taking them over, and taking Black people from slave ships and bringing them to Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone became this mecca for Black folks, not just from here, but from all over the quote unquote seas, as Blacks were I say rescued. The slavery they started to rescue us and bring us to Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone, the town of Freetown, is attributed to being founded by Thomas Peters.
Right.
And it was a combination of all these Blacks from all over Africa and Canada and Jamaica who created that space. And they created a community called the Creole, and it's an incredible story on its own. And like I said, I mean, I would have loved to have told that story, but the problem was COVID, and I wasn't able to go to Jamaica to film in the middle of COVID and go to Sierra Leone to film in the middle of COVID. So the story then, incorporated
got a bit truncated.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. All right. So let's talk a bit about the Canadian PR machine, right? Because Canada's positioned as this great melting pot of cultures. And I actually believed that hype until 2020. Right? So, Sudz, can you talk about how that narrative, which we saw in this episode, was started by the British against the US to say, oh, the US is brutal and they're slavers, but we are not. It's freedom here. Can you talk about how this whole narrative that is still pervasive today, or it tries to be, is an attempt to hide the brutality of Canadian white supremacy?
Well, I think that in terms of the history of this country, it has been sanitized for that purpose, to project an image of, just this is not America. We are not slavers here. We are freedom. So we had an act to abolish slavery that was a gradual abolition of slavery in 1793, the first piece of legislation in all of the UK, sponsored by John Graves Simcoe. And that's something that we learn that is we are the harbingers of freedom, and that Canada is synonymous as freedom in this moment. So this 1793, and this spreads like wildfire throughout slaves and so on and so forth. Slaves and also people who own slaves, because they were worried about their investment. So fast forward to the 1800s and the Underground Railroad. That 31-year history that we have is basically through the abolition of slavery in 1834 to 1865. That 31-year history of the Underground Railroad, that's become our national identity.
Yeah.
And so when that idea sort of becomes viral and takes root, that's the myth that Canada tells itself. That's the myth that is in all the history books, and that 31-year history period is the story that we tell ourselves about this nation. We don't talk about genocide. We don't talk about conquest. We don't talk about exactly what happened to where the indigenous folks used to be all over the place. You have villages and towns here. like where Toronto is. That was a village there. All those people got removed, and so we don't talk about any of that stuff because it's very messy, and because there's a lot of death involved there. There's all kinds of bad things there. So we don't talk about that. We just sort of don't look over here, look over here, to the point where, we're not slavers like the Americans. George Eliot Clark says it very eloquently. We had to define ourselves anew. The British descendant Canadians had to define themselves anew away from America, because they're like, well, why aren't we American? Why didn't we not, revolt against the king? So because of this, we like sort of wrap ourselves in this identity of being sort of free people, and we are nonviolent and peaceful and blah, 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 blah. And whereas we don't actually recognize the violence and the brutality that which we had to settle the land. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the 200 years of slaveries that preceded preceded abolition. We were slavers for 200 years on these lands. And it's very complicated because we had indigenous slavery here too. So it's very, very complicated, but we don't want to talk about it, right? And so by taking this stuff, this very thorny, this very difficult stuff, we want to talk about it and say, let's have a conversation, because we're believing, these false idols, the myth making of Canada as an entity, as a nation, it's not been honest. Like most countries, America is honest about their myth making, but we're talking about our national story here. We have to be honest, and we have to be, history is a lot more complex and a lot more diverse than we ever thought. And I think that is liberating in and of itself to the people who are part of Canada, and the new immigrants coming in, and the children who don't believe that they're stakeholders here, because there's so many kids, Black kids, who don't feel that they got a place here, who don't feel like they belong here. And this documentary series says you belong. We all belong to this national story, and we're all actors. We have a woman named Elise Harding Davis, who is a former curator of the Amherstburg Theater Museum, and she says, we are the Black thread in the tapestry of this nation.
Yeah.
That's who we are, and we've been here.
Another quote from the episode that I want to touch on is one of the experts said, reparations transform social relations. Can you briefly talk about the $3 million fund in Nova Scotia, the land title fund, and how that can actually transform the reality and legacy of Black people that built cities in communities in Nova Scotia?
Okay, absolutely. So that was Wayne Hamilton, and his job is actually to make transitions for Blacks in Nova Scotia to be responsible and receptive to that community. And I asked him the question of reparations because, what happened was, off the top, those loyalists, they were promised land, they were promised freedom. They did not get the land. They were given, as Dr. Clark says, sometimes 10 acres maximum, or mostly not at all. And the thing is, you couldn't make a living off 10 acres. So while they were getting 10 acres, white settlers, the lowest they were getting were 100 acres.
Oh, wow.
Okay. There were those who got thousands of acres. The wealthy got thousands of acres. Okay. And so, Black people in, for example, places like Preston, they squatted because they weren't actually given the land, right? And then when the Black refugees came, they gave them permit for occupancy on land that nobody wanted, that they didn't own it. So they were paying taxes on this, but they didn't own the lands. So now you flash forward 300 years later, and Black people have been on some of these lands for as long as this, but don't own it. So the office, that $3.4 million, that is meant to settle land claims to help Blacks get title to land that their families have been on for centuries. Okay? It doesn't address the fact that maybe that they really did only get 10 acres or no specific amounts. It doesn't give them what white loyalists soldiers and settlers were given. So the question of reparations, that's the least the government can do, is help Blacks settle the land title. That's the least. The question of reparation, I was really happy to introduce that question because these Black folks are, in my mind, a distinct society, no different than the Acadians or the French, right? And so what does that mean? So what, as a government, are we responsible to do for these first peoples that were not indigenous, who came and settled and contribute to the land? So I'm hoping, at the very least, the land claim is absolutely something that must be done. But I want to see a real conversation come about. So one of the things that Wayne Hamilton put forward, for example, were these early descendants of these early Blacks, education, have it be free, because there was a lack of access to that. And remember, Nova Scotia is the last province to have segregation, right? So so you have to look at all of this kind of stuff. So for me, the question of reparations is definitely land titles, but it's much bigger than that for me, particularly for these folks.
All right. So thanks again, Jennifer and Sudz, for joining us here today. You can stream BLK and Origin Story anytime on Stack TV or the Global TV app. And if you have Global or History Channel, go ahead and watch it there. Subscribe to juliemangotv for more conversations with Caribbean storytellers. Until next time, walk good.